I had lived in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Greenfield Estates for exactly 3 months before realizing I had made a terrible mistake. At first, the cul-de-sac seemed ideal, well-maintained lawns, friendly neighbors, or so I thought, and a local park within walking distance. The Homeowners Association, HOA, was strict, but I wasn't worried. I didn't plan on throwing wild parties or painting my house neon green. I was just an ordinary guy, working from home, keeping to myself. But that was before I met Karen. I never got her last name. She lived 3 houses down in an oversized, beige McMansion, complete with a perfectly manicured lawn and a personality to match, rigid, artificial, and completely overbearing. The first time she spoke to me, it was about trash bins. I had just finished dragging mine to the curb when she appeared out of nowhere, arms crossed over her chest, wearing an expression of deep disappointment, like I had personally offended her ancestors. "You left your bin out for 4 extra hours last week," she announced as if reading a court verdict. "It's supposed to be brought in by 10 a.m. the next morning. HA rules." I blinked at her. It was 2 p.m. "Rules are rules," she said stiffly. Then, before I could respond, she snapped a photo of my driveway with her phone. And just like that, I had my first official HOA complaint. I should have seen it coming. A week after Trashgate, I made the mistake of leaving my bike leaning against my front porch instead of storing it in the garage. A normal person would have ignored it. Karen was not a normal person. At precisely 10:30 a.m., I heard the familiar shrill voice outside my window. Unbelievable. I peeked through the blinds. There she was, standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed so tightly her veins were probably about to pop. She stared at my bike like it was a nuclear warhead. Then, to my utter disbelief, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. I couldn't hear the conversation word for word, but I caught enough. "Yes, officer, there's a vehicle illegally parked on private property." Pause. "No, it's not my property, but it's against HOA guidelines." Another pause. "It's a bicycle, but it's messy, and it's ruining the look of the neighborhood." I felt my soul leave my body. This woman had just reported my bike to the police. I half considered moving it just to avoid dealing with whatever nonsense was coming next. But then I stopped myself. No, she was being ridiculous, and I refused to give in. So I waited. 20 minutes later, a police cruiser rolled into the neighborhood. A stocky officer with a world-weary expression stepped out of the vehicle. His name tag read Sanchez, and judging by his face, this was far from his first encounter with a suburban nightmare. Karen practically sprinted toward him. "Officer, thank God you're here. That bike is an eyesore. He's violating HOA rules and..." Sanchez sighed. "Ma'am, you called the police over a bike?" "Yes," she huffed. "It's a violation." The officer turned to me. "Is that your bike?" "Yep," I said. "And it's on your property?" "Yep." Sanchez stared at Karen for a long moment. Then, in the most exhausted voice imaginable, he said, "Ma'am, this isn't a police matter." Karen's entire face twitched. But the HOA rules say." "HOA rules aren't laws," he cut her off. "They don't override private property rights. He can park his bike wherever he wants on his own land." Karen looked like she had just swallowed a lemon whole. "But it looks so messy," she screeched. Sanchez pinched the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, this is the 3rd time this month you've called about a neighbor's property. You called about the trash bins. You called about someone's lawn not being trimmed to your liking." He exhaled sharply. "If you keep making frivolous 911 calls, you could be fined for misuse of emergency services." Karen turned red. "But..." "Final warning," Sanchez said. She stood there, speechless. For the first time since meeting her, she had no response. I savored the moment. Finally, she spun on her heel and stormed off. Officer Sanchez turned back to me. "You good?" "Better than ever." He nodded, muttering, "HOA people, man," before heading back to his cruiser. As he drove off, I looked over at Karen's house. She was watching me from her window, seething. I grinned and parked my bike even closer to the porch. To be continued. I knew Karen well enough by now to realize one thing: she never admitted defeat. Losing the bike battle to Officer Sanchez had embarrassed her in front of the entire cul-de-sac. But instead of letting it go like a rational person, she did what all entitled HOA warriors do. She doubled down. The next morning, I found a violation notice taped to my front door. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that a bicycle has been improperly stored on your front lawn. As per HOA regulations, all personal vehicles must be stored inside an enclosed structure. Failure to comply may result in fines or further action. Sincerely, Greenfield Estates HOA Compliance Committee. I stared at the paper. This woman had wasted police resources over my bike, gotten publicly shut down, and now she was dragging the entire HOA into her vendetta? I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I calmly walked to Karen's house and knocked on the door. It swung open so fast I barely had time to react. Karen stood there, arms crossed, already gloating. See, she said smugly. The HOA agrees with me. If you don't move that bike, you'll be fined. Rules are rules. I smirked. Actually, Karen, I have a question. She narrowed her eyes. What? I held up the notice. Is this an official violation? She scoffed. Obviously. I grinned. Funny, because I just called the HOA office. Turns out, this wasn't sent by them. Karen's face twitched. You faked this, didn't you? I pressed. You printed it yourself and stuck it on my door. She flushed deep red. That's ridiculous. I pulled out my phone. Should I call Officer Sanchez back? Pretty sure falsifying HOA documents is fraud. She slammed the door in my face. I walked back home, laughing the entire way. After the fake violation notice failed, I thought Karen might finally back off. I was wrong. Instead, she escalated to petty warfare. First, my mailbox mysteriously disappeared overnight. I had to retrieve it from the middle of my yard. Then, my sprinklers stopped working. A quick check revealed that someone, gee, I wonder who, had shut off my water valve. The final straw came when I woke up one morning to find a bright orange HOA violation sign staked in my front lawn. In huge, bold letters, it read, "This home is in violation of HOA standards." And the best part? Karen's house had a matching sign in her yard, except hers was perfectly clean and brand new, while mine had been shoved deep into the dirt like a public shaming ritual. I stood there, taking in the ridiculous sight. And then, I smiled. If she wanted petty, I could do petty. That evening, I walked over to Karen's yard, took her pristine violation sign, and planted it right back in front of her door. Then, I went to my garage, grabbed Christmas lights, and wrapped them around my bike like a glowing art display. For extra effect, I taped a copy of the police report from Officer Sanchez to the handlebars. The next morning, Karen stepped outside and screamed. She stormed toward my house, but just as she reached my porch, my next-door neighbor Greg stepped outside. Now, Greg was a legend. He was retired, spent his days sipping beer on his porch, and had zero tolerance for HOA nonsense. Karen, he called, taking a sip from his coffee mug. You ever get tired of being the worst person in this neighborhood? Karen froze. Greg smirked. Because, honestly, it's exhausting watching you lose every time. She turned bright red and stormed back home. Greg raised his coffee toward me like a salute. I nodded back. I knew Karen wasn't done. She was fuming, but after being humiliated twice, she had to be careful. That's when I had an idea. I called the real HOA office and requested an official review of her home. Because guess what? Karen had violations of her own. Her garden gnome collection? HOA banned lawn clutter. Her hedge height? Too tall by regulation standards. Her backyard gazebo? Built without a permit. The HOA inspector came the next day. And when I say Karen exploded, I mean she nearly went feral. She tried arguing. She tried blaming me. But the inspector wasn't having it. By the time they left, Karen had been handed 3 separate violation notices, real ones. I leaned against my porch, watching the meltdown with pure satisfaction. She turned, locking eyes with me. You. I smiled. Rules are rules, Karen. Her mouth opened, then snapped shut. For the first time ever, she had no comeback. For the next week, Karen was unusually quiet. No passive-aggressive comments. No fake notices. No random HOA crusades. She was planning something. I could feel it. Then, one morning, I stepped outside to grab my mail, half expecting it to be missing again, and saw Karen standing in my yard. Hands on hips. Face seething. Oh, great. I exhaled. Karen. She jabbed a finger toward my bike, which was still on my porch, wrapped in glowing Christmas lights, just to annoy her. This, she snapped. You think you're funny? You think you've won? I shrugged. Pretty much, yeah. She huffed. You're a nuisance to this neighborhood. Funny, I mused. Greg seems to like me just fine. So does Mrs. Patel. And the Wilsons. And, the entire HOA board now that they know you've been filing fake complaints. Her left eye twitched. That's it, she spat. If the HOA won't do anything, I will. Then, to my absolute shock, she grabbed my bike and started dragging it toward the curb. I stared. Karen, what the hell are you doing? If you won't store it properly, I'll have it removed. I blinked. You're stealing my bike. It's an eyesore. I pulled out my phone. Cool, let's get that on record. She froze mid-step. Her eyes darted to the phone in my hand. Then to my porch camera, which had been silently recording everything. Then, just as Officer Sanchez's cruiser rolled into the neighborhood, Sanchez stepped out of his car, looking exhausted as usual. His eyes landed on Karen holding my bike and me, standing there with my phone. He sighed. Karen. Karen immediately dropped my bike. Officer, thank goodness you're here. Sanchez pinched the bridge of his nose. Don't. Just don't. But, Karen, I've had 6 separate complaints from your neighbors in the last month. You've called about trash bins. You've called about lawns. You called about a teenager's basketball hoop being too distracting. He exhaled. And now you're stealing a bike? Karen's face turned ghost white. I wasn't stealing it. I was moving it. Without permission? It's against HOA rules. Sanchez crossed his arms. Karen, how many times do I have to tell you? HOA rules aren't laws. She floundered. But, did he give you permission to take it? Silence. I smirked. Nope. Sanchez sighed. Then that's attempted theft. Karen's face dropped. Wait, what? You took property that isn't yours, without consent, and intended to dispose of it. He pulled out his notepad. That's a misdemeanor. Karen's screech could probably be heard in another state. You're arresting me? No, Sanchez said. But I am filing a formal complaint. And if this happens again, you will be arrested. Karen stood there, shaking. Then, without another word, she stormed back to her house and slammed the door. After that day, Karen was never the same. She stopped harassing me. Stopped reporting people. Stopped being the neighborhood dictator. It was like she had finally realized she wasn't untouchable. The final nail in the coffin? The HOA finally cracked down on her violations. Her garden gnomes? Gone. Her overgrown hedges? Trimmed under threat of a fine. Her unapproved gazebo? Completely dismantled. And, the best part? She received a formal warning from the HOA board stating that if she continued harassing neighbors, she could face expulsion from the HOA entirely. And if there's one thing Karen valued more than being a pain in the ass, it was her precious HOA power. So she finally shut up. A few months later, I walked outside to find Karen's house up for sale. Whether she was moving by choice or because the neighborhood turned against her, I'll never know. But as I stood on my porch, watching potential buyers walk through her pristine beige prison, I smiled. Because right there, in plain sight, my bike was still parked on the porch. Exactly where it had been all along. And this time, Karen couldn't do a damn thing about it. 3 weeks after the Great Karen Exodus, as Greg so eloquently called it, a moving truck pulled into Karen's old driveway. I was beyond curious. Would the new owners be another nightmare? A second coming of Karen? Or, if the universe was merciful, someone normal? Greg, ever the neighborhood watchdog, leaned against his porch railing with a beer in hand, watching the movers unload boxes. "Well?" I asked, walking over. Greg took a long sip. "Jury's still out." Then, the new homeowners stepped outside. A young couple, probably in their early 30s. The guy was tall, built like a football player, with an easygoing smile. The woman had a sharp but friendly energy, the type who looked like she could either bake you cookies or destroy you in an argument, depending on the situation. And, get this, they had a bike rack on their SUV. Greg and I exchanged looks. This was going to be interesting. That evening, I did something I never thought I'd do. I brought over a welcome gift. Because, let's be real, after enduring Karen's reign of terror, I wanted to start off on the right foot with these people. I knocked. The door swung open and the guy grinned. "Hey, neighbor." He glanced at the six-pack in my hand. "You read my mind." His wife appeared behind him. "Ignore him. He says that about everything." I laughed. "I figured I'd say welcome before Greg did it first and made you question your life choices." From his porch, Greg shouted, "I heard that." The couple laughed, then introduced themselves. "Name's Mike," the guy said, shaking my hand. "This is Jess." "Nice to meet you," Jess added. Then she leaned in slightly. "So, what's the deal with the previous owner?" The realtor got real cagey when we asked. I grinned. "You want the short version or the long one?" Mike laughed. "Give us the good stuff." So I told them. The fake HOA complaints. The police calls. The bike incident. The moment of divine justice when the HOA turned on her. By the time I finished, they were both in stitches. Jess wiped her eyes. "Oh my God. I love that the HOA finally went after her." Mike grinned. "Man, I wish I could have seen her face." Then he gestured toward my porch. "You know, now that Karen's gone, you can probably take down those Christmas lights wrapped around your bike." I smirked. "Nah, it's a monument now." Mike laughed. "Fair enough." Over the next few weeks, something unbelievable happened. For the first time since moving to Greenfield Estates, I felt relaxed. No complaints. No random HOA notices. No passive-aggressive notes on my door. The neighborhood was finally normal. Greg, in his infinite wisdom, summed it up best. "Man," he said one afternoon, sitting on his porch, beer in hand. "It's kind of boring now." I snorted. "Yeah, and I love it." He nodded. "Same." As I leaned back in my chair, staring at the peaceful street ahead, I couldn't help but think. This wasn't just a win. It was victory. Just when I thought peace had finally settled, Greenfield Estates proved me wrong. Because the HOA? They weren't done. With Karen gone, they needed a new target. And guess who they set their sights on? Greg. It started with a letter. One evening, Greg found an official-looking HOA notice stuffed in his mailbox. It read, "Notice of Noncompliance. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that your property contains the following violations **. Unauthorized lawn decorations. Improper patio seating arrangement. Excessive beverage consumption on premises **. Failure to comply within 7 days may result in fines or further action. Sincerely, Greenfield Estates HOA Compliance Committee." Greg read it aloud. Then he burst out laughing. "The hell is excessive beverage consumption supposed to mean?" He snorted. "I drink on my own porch." Jess, who had stopped by for a chat, squinted at the letter. Wait. Unauthorized lawn decorations." Greg grinned. "Oh yeah, they mean my flamingos." Now, here's the thing about Greg. He had exactly 3 pink plastic flamingos planted in his front yard. Nothing excessive. Nothing obnoxious. Just 3 friendly little birds standing proudly in his grass. And apparently, that was one too many for the HOA. "You know," I mused, leaning back on my porch railing. "The reasonable thing to do would be to take them down." Greg smirked. "Good thing I'm not reasonable." The next morning, Greg tripled the number of flamingos in his yard. By that afternoon, half the neighborhood joined in. Jess put 6 flamingos in her flower bed. Mike tied one to his mailbox. Even old Mrs. Patel, who usually stayed out of drama, put a single defiant flamingo on her front step. By the end of the week, The entire cul-de-sac was covered in pink plastic birds. The HOA had lost control. 2 days later, a furious HOA rep, some stiff-looking guy in khakis named Ted, stormed up to Greg's porch. "Greg," Ted snapped, waving a clipboard. "This is a direct violation of HOA aesthetic standards." Greg sipped his beer. "Is it?" "Yes," Ted fumed. "You started this flamingo infestation." Greg grinned. "I dunno, Ted. Looks more like a neighborhood movement." Ted's eye twitched. "You have 24 hours to remove them." Greg took a long sip, then smirked. "Or what?" Ted opened his mouth, then froze. Because, at that moment, Officer Sanchez's cruiser pulled up. Sanchez, looking completely done with life, stepped out. He took one look at the situation. Then, in his most exhausted voice yet, asked, "All right, who's the problem this time?" Ted straightened. "Officer, I'd like to report a widespread HOA violation involving unauthorized decorations." Sanchez held up a hand. "Is this about the flamingos?" "Yes," Sanchez sighed. "Ted, lawn ornaments aren't illegal. But the HOA guidelines are not laws," Sanchez interrupted. "We've been over this." Ted stammered. But. Then Greg delivered the final blow. He held up his own copy of the HOA rules, flipped to a specific section, and read aloud. "Decorative items must be kept in a neat and organized manner and must not obstruct pathways or driveways." Then he grinned. "Nowhere does it say we can't have flamingos." Ted's face went pale. Sanchez, to his credit, tried not to laugh. "So," Greg said, leaning back, "unless you want to rewrite the rule book, the flamingos stay." Ted stormed off, muttering angrily under his breath. And just like that, the neighborhood won again. The HOA never bothered us again. Ted resigned from the board 2 months later. Karen's house? Still up for sale. Greg? He became a local legend. And the flamingos? They're still there, standing proudly in yards across Greenfield Estates. A permanent reminder that sometimes the best revenge is plastic and pink. Just when we thought life in Greenfield Estates had finally settled into peaceful suburban bliss, the universe decided to throw us a curveball. It happened on a Friday afternoon. Greg and I were sitting on his porch, admiring the glorious sea of pink flamingos still standing proudly in the neighborhood. Jess and Mike had joined us, beers in hand, when a sleek black SUV rolled into Karen's old driveway. We all went dead silent. The car door opened. And then, she stepped out. Karen was back. Jess nearly choked on her drink. No way. She's gone." Greg squinted. "Maybe she's just checking on the house sale?" Then Karen did something horrifying. She pulled a suitcase out of the trunk. Mike whispered, "Oh, hell no." I felt my soul leave my body. She's moving back. Over the next few days, Karen avoided everyone. She didn't storm into anyone's yard, didn't knock on doors, just quietly settled back in. That's when the rumor started. Mrs. Patel, our unofficial neighborhood news source, broke the story first. Karen wasn't just moving back. She was running for HOA president. Greg literally dropped his beer when he heard. "Oh, that woman does not quit." Jess groaned. "She's trying to take back control. First the flamingos, then our souls." Mike frowned. "Can she even do that?" "Unfortunately, yes. The HOA held elections every 2 years, and the current president, some guy named Bill, was retiring. If Karen campaigned hard enough, she could take over. And if that happened, we were doomed." Karen wasted no time. She started handing out pamphlets with her face on them. Her campaign slogan? "Restoring order to Greenfield Estates." Jess gagged. "I feel like I just read a villain's monologue." Mike flipped through the pamphlet. "Holy crap, she wants to ban flamingos." Greg slammed his fist on the table. "War." That night, we held an emergency meeting. The entire street gathered at Greg's house, where we launched the most ridiculous HOA counter-campaign in history. We called it Keep Greenfield Fun. Jess designed buttons that said "Flamingos Forever." Mike printed flyers featuring Officer Sanchez's report about Karen's bike incident. Greg? Greg went full attack mode and put up a massive banner on his porch that read, "Vote for Karen and lose your pink privileges." By election day, the entire neighborhood was either wearing flamingo merch or actively mocking Karen's campaign. The HOA held the election in the community center. Karen stood at the podium, smug as hell, waiting for her inevitable victory. Then Bill, the outgoing HOA president, took the stage. And the winner, with 73% of the vote is... He glanced at Karen, then grinned. Greg. Karen's jaw dropped. The room erupted in cheers. Greg, looking absolutely delighted, strode up to the stage. Karen was fuming. "This is a joke." Greg grabbed the mic. "Thank you, everyone," he said. "I promise to run the HOA the same way I run my life, lazily and with a beer in hand." Wild applause. "Karen?" She stormed out. And just like that, we won again. Karen? She sold her house 2 weeks later. For real this time. She packed her bags, left town, and Greenfield Estates never saw her again. Greg, now HOA president, passed exactly one new rule. All houses must contain at least one decorative flamingo. And you know what? We all followed it. Because we deserved this victory. Because we survived Karen. And because, at the end of the day, rules are rules. With Karen gone for good, Greenfield Estates finally entered an era of true peace. No more fake HOA complaints. No more police calls over bicycles. No more passive-aggressive notes on doors. For the first time since I moved in, life was normal. Almost too normal. Because as much as we all hated Karen, there was something strangely entertaining about her. Without her, the neighborhood gossip dried up. The HOA meetings were boring. Even Greg, our newly elected lazy HOA president, admitted, "Man, I almost miss messing with her." Then, one fateful afternoon, a new family moved in. A shiny moving truck pulled up to Karen's old house. Greg, Jess, Mike, and I sat on my porch, watching intensely. A middle-aged couple stepped out. They looked normal. Maybe even friendly. Jess let out a breath. Okay, so far so good. Then, the garage door opened. And out stepped a teenage boy with blue hair, wearing a t-shirt that said, "Flamingos rule, HOA drools." Greg choked on his beer. Mike's jaw dropped. Jess grabbed my arm. Oh my God. They're on our side. The kid looked around, nodded approvingly at the flamingos, then pulled a skateboard out of the moving truck and immediately started doing tricks in the driveway. Greg wiped a fake tear from his eye. Karen would have had a heart attack. I grinned. Guys, I think we just found our new favorite neighbor. That evening, I decided to do something symbolic. I took down the Christmas lights from my bike. After all, their job was done. Karen was defeated. Greenfield Estates was safe. The HOA was in the hands of a man who considered beer a personality trait. And flamingos? They were stronger than ever. As I stepped back, admiring my completely normal bike, Greg walked over. End of an era, huh? I nodded. Yep. Then, without a word, Greg handed me a brand new pink plastic flamingo. I took it, smiled, and placed it right next to my porch. After all, some traditions should never die. For a few months, Greenfield Estates enjoyed a golden age of peace and freedom. Greg, in his role as lazy HOA president, mostly ignored complaints unless they were about actual issues, like broken streetlights or raccoons invading garbage cans. The new neighbors, the Carters, fit in perfectly. Their teenage son, Ryan, turned out to be an absolute menace to authority in the best way. Within 2 weeks, he had convinced half the kids on the block to start skateboarding in the cul-de-sac, which would have given Karen a stroke. Life was good. Then, one morning, I stepped outside, expecting to enjoy a peaceful coffee on my porch, and nearly spit it out when I saw a black SUV parked in Karen's old driveway. Jess, who was walking her dog, froze mid-step. Mike, stepping out with a coffee, dropped his mug. Greg, sitting on his porch, whispered a single word. No. The SUV door swung open. But it wasn't Karen. It was Ted. Yes, that Ted. The former HOA enforcer. the man who tried to ban flamingos. And now he was living in Karen's old house. Jess gasped. No, no. He moved in. Mike muttered. The HOA planted him here, didn't they? Greg took a long, suffering sip of his beer. They sent in a replacement Karen. And as if to confirm our worst fears, Ted turned toward us, arms crossed. Then, with a smug smile, he snapped a photo of my bike. Next morning, I found a familiar-looking notice taped to my front door. It was almost nostalgic, except instead of Karen's passive-aggressive handwriting, it was a typed message with an official-looking HOA letterhead. I sighed. Here we go again. Notice of noncompliance. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that a bicycle has been left in public view on your property. As per HOA regulations, all personal vehicles must be stored inside an enclosed structure. Failure to comply within 48 hours may result in fines. Sincerely, Greenfield Estates HOA Compliance Committee. P.S. As a reminder, HOA rules are in place to maintain the elegance of our neighborhood. I groaned. Of course Ted was bringing back the bike war. Jess, who had just stepped outside, took one look at the notice and snorted. Oh, this guy really wants to die on the same hill as Karen. Mike, reading over my shoulder, muttered, You'd think after the Flamingo Rebellion, they'd learn. Greg, walking up with a beer at 9:30 a.m., chuckled. So, what's the plan? I grinned. We fight back. If Ted wanted to declare war, we were going to make sure he regretted it immediately. First, I ignored the violation. Then, I took 3 extra bikes, some borrowed from Mike and Jess, and parked them neatly next to my porch. For good measure, I also printed out a copy of the police report from Karen's bike incident and taped it to my mailbox under the words, HOA rules are not laws, Ted. By the time Ted came by to inspect his crime scene, the entire cul-de-sac was watching from their porches, sipping coffee like it was primetime television. Ted's face turned red as he took in the sight. Then, Greg wheeled out a bike onto his porch. Then Mike. Then Mrs. Patel, who didn't even own a bike, rolled out her grandson's tricycle and parked it on her lawn. By the end of the day, every single house in the neighborhood had at least one bike parked in their yard. We had created the first-ever HOA-sanctioned bicycle rebellion. The next morning, Ted stormed over to Greg's porch, absolutely fuming. This is ridiculous. Ted snapped, waving a clipboard like a weapon. You're all in violation. Greg, sipping his beer, shrugged. Oh! I thought we were just being neighborly and getting more exercise. Ted's eye twitched. This is mockery. Greg grinned. You catch on quick, Ted. Ted turned on his heel and marched straight to my porch. You think this is funny? He growled. I smiled. Oh, Ted. I don't think it's funny. I think it's historical. He pointed at the police report taped to my mailbox. You're making a joke out of HOA regulations. I shrugged. Well, considering the last time you tried enforcing these rules, the police literally laughed at you. Yeah, Ted. It's a joke. Ted's face turned purple. I will have these bikes removed, he snapped. And if you don't comply, I'll call a special HOA hearing to enforce disciplinary actions. Greg leaned over from his chair. Hey, Ted. Ted whipped around. What? Greg smirked. Aren't you forgetting something? Ted frowned. What? Greg pulled out a stack of HOA bylaws and flipped to a very specific page. Then, in the smuggest voice possible, he read aloud. Decorative items, including bicycles, may be displayed neatly on personal property, provided they do not obstruct pathways. The crowd watching from their porches gasped dramatically. Ted's soul left his body. Greg grinned. Oops. Looks like you just wasted everyone's time. Ted stormed off without another word. A week passed. No more notices. No more threats. Ted was radio silent. But I knew he was waiting for revenge. So, I gave him one last gift. One evening, under the glow of porch lights, I grabbed a can of gold spray paint and coated my bike in a shimmering, ridiculous layer of metallic gold. Then, I added a plaque next to it that read, In honor of the great HOA bike wars of Greenfield Estates. The next morning, Ted walked by, stopped, stared at the golden bike shrine. His eye twitched. And then, he just walked away. Ted never bothered me again. The HOA quietly dropped any complaints about bikes. And Officer Sanchez? He stopped by one day, looked at the golden bike, sighed, and muttered, "You guys are gonna be the reason I retire early." We never heard another word from Ted. Greenfield Estates remained Karen-free. Greg remained the best HOA president of all time. And the legend of the bike war lived on. For a while, things in Greenfield Estates were suspiciously quiet. Ted, after publicly humiliating himself in the Great Bike War, had gone radio silent. No more fake violation notices. No more clipboard waving tantrums. No more sneaky HOA rule enforcement. It felt unnatural. And that's how we knew something was coming. One afternoon, official-looking flyers appeared on every doorstep. Mandatory HOA meeting. Dear homeowners, a special HOA meeting has been called to discuss new enforcement policies and community regulations. Attendance is highly recommended. Date: this Friday. Time: 6 p.m. Location: Greenfield Estates Community Hall. Sincerely, Greenfield Estates HOA Compliance Committee. Jess read the flyer and groaned. Oh great. Ted's trying to pull some HOA power move. Mike frowned. You think he's planning something? Greg, cracking open a beer, nodded. Oh, absolutely. Ted doesn't go down without one last temper tantrum. I glanced at my gold-painted bike shrine, still proudly displayed on my porch. Ted had lost every battle against us so far. But now? He was going for the nuclear option. Friday arrived, and half the neighborhood packed into the community hall, buzzing with curiosity and suspicion. Ted stood at the podium, flanked by two other HOA board members, probably the only people who still supported him after the Flamingo and bike rebellions. He cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. The crowd muttered suspiciously. Ted adjusted his papers and continued. As you know, the HOA is committed to maintaining the beauty and order of Greenfield Estates. However, recent disruptions have created an environment that threatens our community's standards. Jess whispered, "He's talking about the flamingos." Mike muttered, "And the bikes." Greg took a long sip of beer. "And us." Ted scanned the room, then dropped the bombshell. Effective immediately, I am proposing a new set of community regulations to prevent further disorder. He pulled out a printed list and started reading. 1. All lawn decorations must be approved by the HOA before display. 2. Bicycles may not be stored in front yards or porches. 3. All outdoor furniture must conform to HOA aesthetic guidelines. 4. Front porch social gatherings must remain below 6 people to reduce noise levels. 5. Alcohol consumption on porches must be kept discreet to maintain neighborhood elegance. The room went dead silent. Then, Greg coughed. Did he just try to outlaw beer and lawn flamingos? Jess, staring at the list, gasped dramatically. And bikes? Mike shook his head. Oh, this man has lost his damn mind. The entire neighborhood erupted. You can't ban bikes. This is ridiculous. Are you serious about the porch gatherings? What does discreet alcohol consumption even mean? Ted held up a hand. No. This is to improve the quality of. No one wants this, Ted. Greg shouted. The crowd cheered in agreement. Ted's face twitched. The HOA has the right to enforce community guidelines. Greg, standing up, grinned like a man about to end someone's career. Oh, really? He pulled out a stack of papers and dropped them on the podium. Because I just reviewed the HOA bylaws, Ted. And guess what? Ted blinked. What? Greg smirked. You can't make new rules without a full community vote. The crowd went wild. Ted's entire soul left his body. Ted tried one last desperate plea. You can't possibly think bikes and flamingos are good for property values. Greg, with a perfectly straight face, took a sip of his beer. Then said, Who here thinks Ted should shut up? Every single hand in the room shot up. Ted's mouth fell open. You can't just. Greg grinned. And who here votes to keep bikes, flamingos, and porch beers legal? Every hand went up again. Ted collapsed into his chair, utterly defeated. The HOA board members next to him looked uncomfortable. One of them whispered something and then, "We, officially withdraw these proposals." The meeting ended with Ted's final loss. People left in celebration, slapping Greg on the back, making mocking toasts to Ted's failure. Mike walked over to me, shaking his head. "Man, we have destroyed this dude's entire existence." Jess laughed. "And I have no regrets." Greg, standing proudly, took one last victory sip of his beer, then looked at Ted and said, "Rules are rules, buddy." Ted stormed out, defeated forever. Ted moved out 3 months later. We never saw him again. Greg remained HOA president, mostly doing absolutely nothing except hosting barbecue nights. The flamingos? Still there. The bikes? Still parked proudly. The porch beers? Drank freely without fear. And most importantly, Greenfield Estates finally belonged to the people. With Ted gone, Greenfield Estates finally entered its true golden era. Greg, the laziest and most beloved HOA president in history, did exactly what we all expected, absolutely nothing. HOA meetings? Rare, and only if beer and barbecue were involved. New rules? None. Complaints? Only about real issues, like, whose dog is stealing my newspaper, or did anyone else see that raccoon break into Mrs. Patel's garage? For the first time ever, Greenfield Estates felt like a real community instead of a petty dictatorship. But peace never lasts forever. Because just when we thought we were finally free, the HOA headquarters sent someone new. One crisp Saturday morning, a brand new Mercedes rolled into the neighborhood. A woman in high heels and a perfectly tailored blazer stepped out, clutching a leather portfolio like it contained the secrets of the universe. She had the sharpest haircut I had ever seen. Her expression? Pure judgment. Jess, who had been watering her plants, froze mid-spritz. "Oh no." Mike, mowing his lawn, killed the engine instantly. "Oh hell no." Greg, still in his pajamas with a beer in hand, squinted. "Who the hell is that?" The woman marched straight toward Greg's porch. "Excuse me," she said in a tone that could cut glass. "I need to speak with the HOA president." Greg took a long, slow sip of his beer. "You found him." She frowned. "You're Greg?" Greg stretched. "In the flesh." The woman's expression twitched. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, voice tight. "I'm Victoria Blackwell. I've been sent by HOA Corporate to audit Greenfield Estates." We all stared. Jess whispered, "Corporate?" "Oh, we're so screwed." Mike ran a hand through his hair. "We beat Karen. We beat Ted. But a corporate HOA rep?" Greg finished his beer, then crushed the can dramatically. "Bring it on, lady." Victoria Blackwell looked around Greenfield Estates with the disdain of a queen inspecting a peasant village. Her sharp eyes scanned every lawn, every porch, every driveway, until they landed on my golden bike shrine. Her entire face twitched. Then, she slowly turned back to Greg. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, flipping open her corporate HOA binder, "this neighborhood is a disgrace to the Greenfield Estates brand." Greg blinked. "We have a brand?" Victoria ignored him. "In my preliminary walkthrough, I have already observed multiple violations," she continued, scanning her notes. She started listing them off. Unapproved lawn decorations. Flamingos. Improper bicycle storage. My bike shrine. Unregulated porch gatherings. Greg's Porch Beer Club. Unauthorized modifications to common areas. The picnic tables we all chipped in to add at the park. Jess's jaw dropped. Wait, did she just call our picnic tables a violation? Victoria snapped her binder shut. "I will be conducting a full compliance audit, effective immediately," she declared. "And once my report is finalized, Greenfield Estates will be restored to proper HOA standards." Mike muttered, "We are so screwed." "Greg?" Greg just grinned. By the next morning, Victoria Blackwell had set up a full-blown war room inside the HOA office. She was not like Karen. She was not like Ted. She was worse. Because she was organized. Within 24 hours, she had mailed out over 30 violation notices. Everyone got one. My offense? Obstructive, unsightly bicycle display. Greg's? Unauthorized porch gathering with alcohol. Jess? Lawn ornamentation exceeding aesthetic regulations. Mike? Failure to maintain uniform mailbox coloring. Even Mrs. Patel got a notice. Her crime? Feeding stray cats in a way that encourages loitering. Greg lost it. Loitering cats? Are you kidding me? We had faced HOA tyranny before. But this? This was corporate warfare. And if Victoria Blackwell wanted to drown us in paperwork, then we were going to return the favor. Step 1. Appeal everything. Every single resident in Greenfield Estates filed formal appeals against their violations. We buried the HOA office in over 100 individual paperwork requests. Even Mrs. Patel, who hated confrontation, walked into the HOA office and slammed a 3-page appeal onto Victoria's desk. "You will not tell me I cannot feed my cats," she said coldly. Victoria did not look amused. Step 2. The compliance nightmare. If Victoria wanted us to follow every HOA rule, we were going to do it too perfectly. Mike repainted his mailbox every 12 hours in slightly different shades of beige, forcing Victoria to inspect it daily. Jess submitted 17 separate requests for individual flamingo approvals, clogging the system. Greg, as HOA president, scheduled daily HOA meetings, since technically, HOA policy required in-person discussion for all neighborhood-wide changes. Victoria was forced to attend every single one. Greg always started the meetings the same way. "All right, let's begin. First order of business, should we rename the community dog park to Ted's Final Resting Place?" By week 2, Victoria was visibly exhausted. After 2 weeks of fighting, Victoria had enough. She called for an emergency meeting at the HOA office. Everyone showed up, fully expecting a final showdown. Victoria stood at the podium, looking like she had aged 5 years. She took a deep breath. Due to unforeseen challenges, she said through gritted teeth, the Greenfield Estates corporate intervention will be terminated. The room erupted into cheers. Greg, sipping his beer, leaned back and smirked. "That means you're leaving, doesn't it?" Victoria's eye twitched. "Yes," she snapped. Then she stormed out. With Victoria gone, the HOA went back to normal. The flamingos? Still standing. The Golden Bike Shrine? Still there. Greg's Beer Club? Bigger than ever. And for the first time in Greenfield history, we finally won. For the first time since moving to Greenfield Estates, I felt something I never thought possible. Absolute peace. No HOA dictators breathing down our necks. No Karen calling the cops over bicycles. No Ted measuring our lawns with a ruler. No corporate auditors trying to turn our neighborhood into a Stepford Wives dystopia. Just normal suburban life, with a few pink flamingos and porch beers thrown in for good measure. The entire neighborhood felt it. Jess and Mike hosted a celebratory barbecue in their backyard. Greg, naturally, declared it an official HOA-sanctioned event and made a fake certificate of approval just to be petty. The best part? Someone, Greg, ordered a 6-foot inflatable flamingo and placed it right at the entrance to Greenfield Estates with a banner that read, "Welcome to Flamingo Country. No HOA tyrants allowed." I couldn't have been prouder. One afternoon, about a month later, I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the sight of my gold-plated bike shrine, when a familiar-looking police cruiser rolled up. Officer Sanchez stepped out, shaking his head in disbelief. "You know," he muttered, eyeing the golden bike, "I've been patrolling this neighborhood for years, and I still don't know what the hell is wrong with you people." I grinned. "Sanchez, that sounds like an accusation." He sighed. "No, just a statement." Then he handed me an envelope. I frowned. "What's this?" "Someone mailed it to the station, addressed to you." I blinked. "Wait, what?" "It came from out of state," Sanchez continued, "but when we saw the return name, we figured we should hand-deliver it." I flipped the envelope over and read the sender's name. My stomach dropped, because written neatly on the back was one single word: Karen. I stared at the envelope like it might burst into flames in my hands. Jess and Mike, who had wandered over, saw my expression. "Dude, Mike said slowly. Why do you look like you just saw a ghost? I turned the letter toward them. Jess squinted. Wait. Karen. Greg, who had been sitting nearby, immediately perked up. Oh, this is gonna be good. Sanchez sighed. I don't get paid enough for this neighborhood. Then he walked off, waving me off like I was no longer his problem. I took a deep breath and opened the letter. Dear neighbor, yes, you. I assume by now that you celebrated my departure with some kind of childish display. Probably flamingos or beer-related nonsense. Whatever. I don't care. I'm writing to inform you that, after much thought, I have decided to let go of Greenfield Estates. It was a waste of my time and energy trying to create a proper, refined neighborhood among people who have no respect for order. I have moved to a new community, a better one. A real HOA community where people understand the value of discipline. I hope you enjoy your little flamingo-infested paradise, because I assure you, without someone like me enforcing proper standards, your property values will plummet. Oh, and one last thing. You're lucky the police were on your side. Next time, you won't be so fortunate. Sincerely. Karen. Silence. Then, Greg burst out laughing. Oh my God, he wheezed. This woman actually thinks we care? Jess shook her head. She moved just to be a nightmare somewhere else? Mike frowned. Wait. What the hell does next time, you won't be so fortunate mean? I reread the last line. I didn't like it. Not one bit. For weeks after that letter, nothing happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done with us yet. Greg, of course, wasn't worried. She's gone, man. Let her go terrorize some new HOA victims. Jess agreed. She's probably making someone else's life miserable right now. Mike, however, wasn't convinced. Asterisk, she went out of her way to write that letter. And that last line? It sounds like a warning. I nodded. Exactly. What if she's planning something? Greg snorted. What's she gonna do? Call the FBI over a flamingo violation? Mike muttered, I wouldn't put it past her. But the truth? Karen didn't need the FBI. Because exactly 1 month later, Greenfield Estates received a very official-looking letter from HOA Corporate. And when Greg opened it, his entire face drained of color. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. Jess grabbed the letter and read aloud. Notice of External HOA Review. Dear homeowners, a formal petition has been submitted to HOA Corporate requesting a compliance review of Greenfield Estates due to numerous community violations. The petition was signed by a former resident, claiming this neighborhood has failed to maintain proper HOA standards and has descended into an unregulated mess. As such, a compliance review committee will be arriving in 30 days to determine if Greenfield Estates is eligible for continued HOA oversight. Failure to meet corporate HOA standards may result in the revocation of Greenfield Estates' HOA charter, effectively dissolving the HOA entirely. Sincerely. HOA Corporate Review Board. Silence. Then Mike muttered the words we were all thinking. Holy crap. Karen is trying to get the HOA shut down. Jess gasped. Wait, is that bad? Greg, still holding the letter, looked up. And then he grinned. Oh no, this is very good. Greg leaned back in his chair, holding the letter like it was a winning lottery ticket. Jess frowned. Greg, why do you look like you just got handed a lifetime supply of free beer? Greg smirked. Because Karen just did us the biggest favor of all time. Mike blinked. Dude, she's trying to destroy the HOA. Exactly, Greg said, waving the letter. And remind me, what's the one thing we've hated since the moment we moved here? Jess gasped. The HOA. Mike's eyes widened. Wait. You're saying... Greg stood up dramatically. Asterisk Karen just gave us the chance to kill the HOA once and for all. For years, Greenfield Estates had been trapped under HOA tyranny. Karen's reign. Ted's clipboard dictatorship. Victoria's corporate audit from hell. And now? The HOA Corporate Review Board was coming to evaluate whether Greenfield Estates still met the requirements to stay under HOA control. Meaning we had one shot, one golden opportunity, to fail so badly that the HOA had no choice but to dissolve completely. And we were not going to waste it. Step 1. turned the neighborhood into a complete disaster. If the HOA inspectors were expecting a well-manicured, uniform suburban paradise, we were going to give them the opposite. Jess, I'm painting my mailbox neon pink. Mike, I'm putting up lawn flamingos. Dozens of them. Greg, I'm organizing a community-wide barbecue and beer bash, which will accidentally spill over into the street. Me, I'm turning the Golden Bike Shrine into a full-blown art installation. Mrs. Patel, normally quiet, cracked her knuckles. I will adopt 20 stray cats and let them roam freely. The neighborhood erupted into cheers. We were going all in. Over the next 2 weeks, Greenfield Estates transformed into an absolute mess. The Flamingo Rebellion. Mike led the charge by tripling the number of flamingos in his yard. Soon, the entire street was covered in pink plastic chaos. The lawn disaster. Jess and a few other neighbors painted their houses random colors. Purple. Green. One guy went full polka dots. The Golden Bike Shrine expansion. I added twinkling LED lights, a rotating platform, and a banner that said, "Blessed by HOA tyranny." The party to end all parties. Greg hosted the biggest beer-fueled HOA protest in history, complete with a slip-and-slide down the street. By the time the HOA inspectors arrived, Greenfield Estates looked like a lawless carnival zone. The HOA Corporate Review Board arrived in black SUVs, looking horrified before they even stepped out of the car. The lead inspector, a tall, stern-looking man named Mr. Langford, surveyed the absolute chaos in front of him. Flamingos everywhere. A polka dot house. Greg, grilling burgers in the middle of the street. Then he saw the Golden Bike Shrine. His eye twitched. What the hell is that? Greg, without missing a beat, took a slow sip of beer and said, "Sir, that is a tribute to our great HOA overlords. Please, bask in its glory." Jess nearly choked on laughter. For the next 2 hours, the inspectors walked through the neighborhood in absolute shock. Everywhere they looked, there was another violation. Mike casually installed a basketball hoop in his driveway while they watched. Mrs. Patel threw cat treats into the air, summoning a swarm of stray cats. Greg handed them burgers and said, "HOA rules say we must foster community engagement. We're engaging." By the end, Mr. Langford looked done. "This is a disaster," he muttered, rubbing his temples. Greenfield Estates has completely abandoned HOA standards. Greg smiled. "Oh no, sir. We're just showing you the real Greenfield Estates. This is who we truly are." Langford turned to his assistants. "Draft the report. This HOA is beyond saving." 1 month later, the results came in. The HOA Corporate Review Board revoked Greenfield Estates' HOA charter. Effective immediately, Greenfield Estates was no longer governed by an HOA. No more fines. No more ridiculous rules. No more Karen. We were free. To celebrate, Greg declared a neighborhood-wide flamingo festival. Live music. Beer. Bikes parked wherever the hell we wanted. As I stood in the middle of the street, watching everyone party like we had just overthrown a dictatorship, Mike raised a beer toward me. "Dude," he said. "We won." I looked around, at the flamingos, the chaos, the people laughing and celebrating. And I grinned. Hell yeah, we did. Greenfield Estates, once ruled by clipboard tyrants and passive-aggressive violation notices, was finally free. No HOA fines. No Karen. No Ted. No Victoria Blackwell marching in with her corporate overlords. Just a community of people who actually enjoyed living here. The Golden Bike Shrine remained standing, now a historical landmark in the neighborhood. The flamingo stayed, becoming a permanent symbol of victory. Greg? He retired as HOA president, having accomplished the impossible, destroying the very system that put him in charge. Jess and Mike officially made the annual Flamingo Festival a thing. Mrs. Patel? Still feeding stray cats. And me? I still kept my bike parked proudly on my porch. Because after everything we'd been through, no one would ever tell me to move it again.